are stories that begin in fire and end in blood, but this one began in silk in 1755 in the glittering city of Vienna. A child was born who would one day become the most hated woman in France. Her name was Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. She entered the world surrounded by music, marble, and the scent of roses, a world so sheltered that pain itself seemed like a rumor. Her laughter was soft, her manners perfect, her smile carefully trained to hide fear. She was never meant to rule. She was meant to be married off, traded like fine porcelain for political peace, and peace was exactly what her mother wanted. Europe was a chessboard, and Maria Theresa moved her daughter like a pawn. When the child turned 14, her fate was sealed with a signature. She was to marry the Dauphin of France, the grandson of Louis XV, and in doing so, secure an alliance that might keep war at bay. The journey from Vienna to Versailles was more than a crossing of borders. It was the crossing from innocence to illusion. As her carriage rolled through the French countryside, villagers gathered to watch, whispering prayers and curiosity. They saw not a girl, but a symbol. The future Queen of France. The living promise of beauty, grace, and endless luxury. None could imagine how that symbol would someday be torn apart by the same people who now cheered for her at the border. She was stripped of everything Austrian, her dress, her jewels, even her name. Maria Antonia became Marie Antoinette, a name tailored for France, polished like crystal, ready for display. She stepped into Versailles as a stranger, with a crown waiting for her. Versailles, the palace of mirrors and madness. Gold leaf covered the walls, perfume hid the rot, and every step echoed with gossip. Here, appearances were more sacred than truth. Every meal was a ceremony, every gesture a performance. The courtiers watched her like vultures draped in silk, whispering about her smile, her walk, her laugh. Every mistake was a scandal, every kindness twisted into weakness. Marie Antoinette was 15. Her husband, Louis Auguste, the awkward and shy Dauphin, was barely 16. He preferred locks, hunting, and solitude over conversation. Their marriage, arranged to unite empires, was as cold as the marble floors beneath their feet. Years passed without an heir, and the court grew restless. They mocked her behind fans and painted lips, whispering the Austrian woman, as if she were an intruder in their perfect world. She tried to adapt. She learned to dance, to charm, to dazzle. She hosted masquerades, wore towering wigs, and smiled until her cheeks ached. She became the very image of royal grace, not because she loved the game, but because she feared losing it. Versailles demanded masks, and she learned to wear hers beautifully. When Louis XV died in 1774, the shy young Dauphin became Louis XVI, King of France. Marie Antoinette became queen at 19. The crowd cheered as the crown was placed upon their heads, and she looked out over a sea of faces that glowed with devotion. But devotion, like gold, can tarnish quickly. The first years of her reign were filled with indulgence. France, though drowning in debt, lived in denial. The court spent fortunes on jewels, gowns, and feasts, while the people outside the palace walls starved. In Paris, bread was scarce. In Versailles, desserts were endless. And at the heart of that glittering dream stood Marie Antoinette, adored by some, envied by many, hated by more. She built her own world within Versailles, the a private retreat of gardens and ponds, where she could escape the suffocating etiquette of the court. There, she dressed as a shepherdess, tended fake farms, and pretended to live simply, unaware of how deeply this would offend a nation collapsing under poverty. To her, it was innocence. To France, it was insult as famine tightened its grip. Pamphlets began to appear in the streets, venomous little sheets of paper filled with lies and poison. They accused the queen of gluttony, adultery, witchcraft, and worse. They called her Madame Deficit, blaming her for every coin missing from the treasury. The truth was far more complex, but the mob didn't want truth. They wanted someone to bleed, and still, Marie Antoinette smiled. The court had taught her that silence was survival, but silence can be misread. To the people, her composure looked like arrogance, her calm like contempt. Her gowns were brighter than their futures, her laughter louder than their hunger. The stage was being set, and the queen had unknowingly taken her place at its center. By the late 1780s, France was falling apart. Crops failed, bread prices soared, and the government teetered on bankruptcy. The king, indecisive and kind but weak, tried to reform taxes, but the nobles resisted. The people demanded justice or vengeance. In the streets of Paris, the air grew thick with anger. Revolution was not yet spoken aloud, but it was coming slow and certain as a storm. On July 14, 1789, the storm broke. The Bastille, symbol of royal tyranny, fell to the mob. Heads were raised on pikes. The revolution had begun. Versailles trembled. Inside the palace, Marie Antoinette stood by her children and listened to the distant roar of the crowd. They were coming for her. She looked at her husband, terrified, helpless, and for the first time, she understood. Crowns do not protect, they only paint targets. That night, the palace guards doubled their watch. Candles flickered in the halls like dying stars. By October, the hunger in Paris had turned to fury. Thousands of women, armed with knives, muskets, and desperation, marched through rain and mud to Versailles, demanding bread. They broke through the gates, through marble and iron, through fear itself. Guards were slaughtered. Blood stained the golden floors. They screamed for the queen. Marie Antoinette, awakened by the chaos, was urged to flee. She ran through the corridors with her children, her heart pounding against her ribs. Outside her chamber doors, men with axes roared her name. When they found her bed empty, they hacked it to pieces, stabbing the silken sheets as if the queen's body might still be hiding within. Eventually, she appeared on the balcony, pale, trembling, but proud. The crowd below raised muskets and shouts. She bowed her head. For a long moment, there was silence. Even the mob, starving and furious, hesitated. In that instant, she was not a queen, not a villain, not a woman of gold, only human. Then, the chants returned, louder than before. To Paris. To Paris, they cried. And so, under armed escort, Marie Antoinette and her family were taken from Versailles, the palace of her dreams, never to return. The journey to Paris was a funeral in disguise. The queen rode in silence, surrounded by thousands of ragged faces staring up at her carriage. Some spat, some wept, some merely watched. As they entered the city, the streets seemed narrower, darker, colder. The people of Paris did not cheer. They stared with eyes hollowed by hunger and hate in the Tuileries Palace. Her new prison disguised as residence, the queen began to fade. Her gowns grew simpler, her laughter rarer. Letters to her family were smuggled out in tears and ink. The court of France was now a cage, and her crown, a burden. But she did not break, not yet. There was still pride in her spine, and something sharper than fear in her eyes. She was a daughter of Austria, and she would not bow to peasants. Yet beneath that strength, something inside her was beginning to die. The revolution devoured days like fire devours wood. The monarchy was slowly dismantled, privilege by privilege, power by power. In June 1791, desperate and deceived by hope, the royal family attempted to escape. Disguised as servants, they fled Paris by night. But fate, cruel as ever, had other plans. In the small town of Valence, a postmaster recognized the king's face from a coin. They were arrested, dragged back to Paris in chains. The image of Marie Antoinette, once radiant and adored, was now plastered across pamphlets, as the enemy of the people. The mob howled beneath her window, night after night, demanding justice. Her children grew pale with fear. Her husband grew quieter with guilt, and through it all, the queen remained still, the same strange calm that had once been mistaken for indifference, now becoming defiance. Then came 1792, the year the monarchy died. France declared itself a republic. The king was put on trial for treason and found guilty. On a gray January morning in 1793, Louis XVI was led to the guillotine. Marie Antoinette was forced to watch from her cell, to hear the drums, the cheers, and the silence that followed. Her husband's last words were for her. Her tears fell on stone. When the door shut behind her that night, she was no longer queen, no longer wife, no longer. But her story was not yet over, because the revolution had taken her crown, but it still wanted her head. The walls of the temple prison were damp, gray, and silent. Within them, the woman once called Your Majesty now slept on straw. Her silk gowns were replaced with coarse fabric, her jewels traded for shekels. Gone were the courtiers, the laughter, the chandeliers. The Queen of France had been stripped not just of her title, but of her identity. Marie Antoinette sat by the small barred window, staring at the pale sky. Every dawn felt heavier than the last. She had learned to count time not by clocks, but by footsteps, the guards' boots pacing down the corridor, the cries of other prisoners dragged away to meet their fate. Each sound was a reminder that death was close, waiting just beyond the stone walls. The king's execution had shaken her, but not broken her. The last time she saw Louis XVI, his eyes were soft, full of guilt and helpless love. "Be brave," he had whispered. "Our suffering will end soon." She had nodded, though her heart was breaking. When his head fell beneath the blade, the world did not stop. It only grew quieter. Paris celebrated. She mourned alone. Now she was a widow, a prisoner, and a symbol. To the revolutionaries, she was the face of everything wrong with France. To the frightened, hidden loyalists, she was a ghost of the old world, already half dead, yet still dangerous. Her children remained locked in a separate cell. They called to her through walls too thick to answer. Her young son, Louis Charles, barely 8 years old, was declared the new king by royalists abroad, but here, in Paris, he was called the wolf cub of the tyrant. The revolutionaries would break him until he forgot his name. In July of 1793, the boy was taken from her arms. She fought, begged, screamed, but the guards tore him away. He was placed under the care of a drunken cobbler who re-educated him through beatings and neglect. From her cell, Marie could hear the child cry out her name in the dark, and she would press her hands over her ears, whispering prayers that no longer reached heaven. Her daughter, Marie-Therese, was left with her for a while longer. The two shared whispers, memories, fragments of lullabies. But the queen knew that soon, she too would be taken. In letters written by candlelight, Marie Antoinette's handwriting began to tremble. "I have no strength left," she wrote to her sister in Austria. "I have nothing but my courage, and it is what I must hold on to, until the end." That end began to form on October 14, 1793. The Revolutionary Tribunal, that grim theater of justice, summoned her to trial. She was led through the streets of Paris in a cart, no longer the golden carriage of her youth, but a rough wooden one splattered with mud. Crowds gathered on both sides, spitting, cursing, throwing insults and stones. Some called her Madame Deficit. Others called her Widow Capit. To them, she was no longer human. She was the embodiment of every hunger they had ever known. Inside the courtroom, her enemies waited. The hall was filled with men whose eyes burned with hatred, and women who watched as though attending a play. The judges, already decided, demanded that she answer to her crimes: high treason, conspiring with Austria, betraying France, and the most cruel of all, corrupting her own son. When that last accusation was spoken, the courtroom fell into a stunned silence. The words hung in the air like poison. Marie Antoinette, who had endured humiliation, hunger, and grief, finally broke. Her eyes filled with tears, her lips trembled, and she turned toward the women of the jury. "If I have not answered," she said softly, "it is because nature itself refuses to answer such a charge against a mother." For the first time, the crowd hesitated. Even revolutionaries shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The human heart, even one hardened by hate, could not escape the truth in her voice. But compassion had no place in the tribunal. The verdict was inevitable. Guilty. Her sentence, death by guillotine. That night, in her cell, Marie Antoinette prayed. She asked for forgiveness, not from the revolution, but from her children, her husband, and from God. She wrote her final letter, addressing it to her sister-in-law. "I die in the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman religion. I forgive all my enemies. I ask pardon of all whom I have offended, and I pray to God for France." Her words were tender, steady, and unshaken. Even her handwriting, though weary, was precise. When the guards entered at dawn, they found her kneeling pale, but calm, at 11 o'clock on October 16, 1793. Marie Antoinette was led from the temple to the guillotine. She wore a plain white dress, the color of mourning in France, her hair cut short to bare her neck. The streets of Paris were lined with tens of thousands of spectators. Some cheered, others stared in silence. She was placed in a cart, the same kind used to carry corpses. As it rolled through the city, she looked neither left nor right. Her hands were bound behind her back, but she held her head high. The jeers of the crowd seemed to fade. All she heard was the beating of her own heart. When the cart reached the Place de la Révolution, the execution platform waited. The blade above glinted in the pale sun like the cold smile of fate itself. The air smelled of iron and rain. She stepped down, carefully, and walked toward the scaffold. The executioner offered his arm. She refused it. Her last act of dignity was her own, as she climbed the wooden steps. She stumbled slightly, and accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. Her final words were not a curse, not a cry, but an apology. "Pardon me, monsieur, I did not do it on purpose." There was a moment of silence. Then the drums began to beat. She was bound to the plank. The blade hovered above like a suspended scream. Her eyes lifted to the gray sky, perhaps seeing the face of her husband, or the smiles of her children, or maybe nothing at all. The world held its breath. The blade fell. A flash of steel. A thud. A gasp that rolled through the crowd. Her head was lifted for all to see. Some cheered. Some turned away. A few crossed themselves in secret. The drums continued until even the sound of death became ordinary, and then silence. Her body was placed in an unmarked grave, her name erased from the world she once ruled. But history is never finished with its ghosts. Years later, when the revolution turned against its own, the same men who condemned her met the same blade. Robespierre, the self-proclaimed voice of the people, screamed as he fell to the guillotine. The reign of terror devoured itself, just as she once predicted in her silence. When peace finally returned to France, her daughter Marie Thérèse was released from prison. Pale, broken, and alone, she carried her mother's last letter close to her heart. She returned to the ruins of Versailles, where ghosts whispered in every corridor. The mirrors were dark, the gardens overgrown. But in one room, her mother's room, the air still smelled faintly of roses and powder. History tried to rebuild her image. Painters softened her eyes, poets wrote of her gentleness, and even her enemies began to admit that perhaps she had been more naive than wicked. Time, that cruel but honest witness, turned her from monster to martyr. In 1815, her remains, and those of Louis XVI, were exhumed and laid to rest in the royal crypt at Saint Denis, the burial place of kings. The tomb was carved in silence. White marble, serene, eternal. For a queen who had once lived in gold, her peace was found only in stone, but her story did not end in the grave. Legends say that on quiet nights, the halls of Versailles echo with soft footsteps, the whisper of silk gliding over marble floors. Some claim to see a pale figure standing by the window, gazing toward Paris. Others say she walks the gardens she once loved, searching for her children. Perhaps history does not forget its tragedies. Perhaps it keeps them alive, so we never forget what vanity and vengeance can do. Marie Antoinette was not innocent, but she was never the monster they made her. She was a mirror reflecting the sickness of an entire age, a world obsessed with beauty, power, and illusion. In her fall, that world saw its own death, and as centuries pass, her name still carries both shame and sorrow. The girl who entered Versailles as a symbol of peace, left it as a warning, a reminder that crowns are made not of gold, but of thorns.